In today's lecture, we'll consider the bleak prospect that maybe we don't have free will at all. In the last lecture, we saw the compatibilist view that determinism and free will are perfectly consistent. That view is at odds with incompatibilists, including libertarians, and the other group that denies free will because they think determinism is true. That group is known as hard determinists. They're known as hard determinists, and that's a label that was coined by William James, who lived from 1842 to 1910. He was an American philosopher and psychologist, and one of the great figures in American intellectual history, with a deep sensitivity to issues in both philosophy and psychology. In fact, the psychology building at Harvard is named after him. It's William James Hall. James called compatibilists soft determinists because they offered a kinder, gentler picture of determinism. And he had only contempt for this view. He wrote, dripping with sarcasm, "Nowadays we have a soft determinism, which abhors harsh words and, repudiating necessity, says that its real name is freedom." But the idea he's saying is that compatibilists are saying determinism is freedom. And he thought the whole thing was just a bag of verbal tricks to try to avoid the real problem of free will. He called the entire compatibilist enterprise a quagmire of evasion. And it was precisely because he thought they were trying to evade the real problem of free will with tricks and verbal sleights of hand. Similarly, the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant had called compatibilism a wretched subterfuge. Although both James and Kant rejected hard determinism, it was not because they thought the hard determinists were shallow. Rather, they thought that there was some other way to defend the belief in free will, libertarian free will. They thought that the hard determinists were admirably facing the problem. They were a worthy adversary, whereas the compatibilists were superficial. Although compatibilism is certainly a more comforting response to determinism, many philosophers think that the main reason people believe in it is because of wishful thinking. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have both free will and determinism at the same time? Presto, you can't. And it's a striking fact that if you look at the history of philosophy from, say, Hobbes through Kant, compatibilists tend to be determinists. That is, the people who say free will is compatible with determinism happen to also think that determinism is true. Why is that? It didn't have to be that way. Someone might have thought that free will is consistent with determinism, but that as it happens, determinism is false. That is, they could think, determinism is perfectly consistent with free will, it just happens to be false. If it had been true, it wouldn't have made any difference. But we don't find philosophers in this traditional period advocating that view. Well, why is that? I think James might have suggested that it's because wishful thinking drives the theory. If you accept determinism, then you're motivated to think it's compatible with free will. Whereas if you don't accept determinism, you wouldn't have this motivation to try to somehow show that free will and determinism are compatible. Some of the evidence from experimental philosophy that we looked at in the last lecture points in the direction of suggesting that people really are naturally inclined to incompatibilism and that maybe they get talked out of it by their philosophy professors. There are two components to hard determinism. Hard determinists are incompatibilists. They think that free will requires that determinism be false, that the proper description of free will includes this requirement that indeterminism has to be a true feature of the universe. Hard determinists typically maintain that compatibilists are just not facing the threat adequately. They're not facing up to the real problem. That incompatibilists are right about the description of what free will requires. In addition, though, hard determinists think that determinism is true, from which they draw the conclusion that there's no such thing as free will. They're skeptics about the existence of free will. They maintain that it doesn't exist. It's useful to get a bit more specific about how this is supposed to work. They maintain that our notion of free will is so deeply connected to the idea of indeterminism that we are simply unfree if determinism is true. This view of free will, that free will doesn't exist, is sometimes called the error theory of free will or free will eliminativism, because they're saying that the view that we have free will is an error and we should eliminate the idea. While these labels are technically more accurate, they're also quite unfamiliar. So we'll stick with the term skeptic for those who deny the existence of free will. So by the term free will skeptic, I just mean a person who claims that there's no such thing as free will. To see the general structure of the hard determinist argument, let's consider some parallel cases. Let's start with a case that the hard determinist would say is not analogous to the situation with free will. Think about the discovery that whales are not fish. For hundreds, maybe thousands of years, people thought whales were fish. This turned out to be wrong. But nobody said, whoa, there's no such thing as a whale. That is, they didn't draw the dramatic conclusion that whales don't exist. They just concluded that we had some misconceptions about whales. We thought they were fish, turns out they were mammals. I guess we need to shift things around a little bit. So, similarly, somebody might say, well, we had some mistaken beliefs about free will. We thought it required that determinism was false, but free will still exists even if determinism turns out to be true. Well, that's not the way the hard determinist thinks about it. The hard determinist thinks that the situation is much closer to the way we now think about witch talk about witches in, say, the 17th century. So in the US, as late as the 17th century, people thought that many deaths and illnesses were caused by witchcraft, supernatural powers of particular individuals. Witches were supposed to be evil women who performed magic, and of course in Puritan New England, women were tried and convicted of being such witches. They were put to death. Now, we all think that that was terribly misguided. These women weren't witches, and neither was anybody else. There's no such thing as witches or warlocks or goblins or elves. Hard determinists want to say something similar about free will. It's a notion that has been kicking around for a long time, but it is deeply defective, just like the 17th century notion of witch. So just like we concluded that there's no such thing as witches, so too should we conclude that there's no such thing as free will. Let's look at one more example that is somewhat less controversial than the witch example because it's based on experimental evidence. Maybe some people believe in witches. That's not an argument that we want to have here. So let's turn to people's intuitive views about the behavior of physical objects. This gets called folk physics. Now, we would hardly expect folk physics to include quantum mechanics or relativity or string theory. But what's surprising is that people's judgments about physical objects, about how physical objects move, diverges even from simple Newtonian physics, the kind of physics that you learned in junior high school. In a series of experiments, adults were given simple questions about motion. For instance, they're asked to specify at what point a plane should release a bomb to hit a target. So the plane is flying over, there's a target, and they ask the subjects, put at X where the plane should be when it drops the bomb. A majority of subjects said the plane should be either directly above the target or slightly beyond it, maybe because the bomb will float backwards. So, of course, bombardiers are better trained. You need to release the bomb well ahead of the target because the bomb will continue moving forward just as the plane continues moving forward. That corresponds to Newton's first law. An object in motion will continue in motion unless there's another force acting on it. Then the experimenters thought, well, maybe this is just cheap talk among the subjects. Maybe they wouldn't really do this if they actually were presented with a task. So they had subjects in the lab. They asked them to drop a ball on a target while walking briskly across the room. And the subjects were terrible at this. Again, they tended to wait until they were either above or past the target to release the ball. In other experiments, they had subjects predict the trajectory of a ball going over a cliff. And many of the subjects said that the ball would continue moving horizontally for a while, and then horizontally and down, and then eventually it would lose its forward motion and it would just drop like a rock, as we say. It would drop straight down. But again, this flies in the face of Newton's first law. The object will continue to move forward until it hits the ground. In this and many other cases, people make deeply mistaken judgments about the motion of projectiles. But what's really interesting here is that there's a systematic explanation for their errors. People seem to think that projectiles move because they have a force impressed upon them. And as this force dissipates, the projectile falls. This actually conforms to a pre-Newtonian theory of physics called impetus theory, where an impetus gets infused into an object and makes it move. That explains why people think the bomb will fall straight down. If it's just dropped, no impetus is imparted to the object. And some people even explicitly explain their judgments in this way. So one subject explained what happens when you throw a ball. He says, a force gets exerted and put into the ball. Now, the important point of all this is that this view of motion, that there is an impetus that gets impressed into an object, is completely wrong. There is no such thing as impetus. So folk physics appeals to something that simply doesn't exist. That is how it is for the hard determinist. The hard determinist says, what you might think of as folk psychology also appeals to something that doesn't exist, the idea of free will. It comes naturally to us, but just like the idea of impetus, it's completely wrong. There's no such thing. So that's the basic framework that they have. The framework that says, if we have free will, it requires that determinism is false, determinism is true, and that means our concept of free will is so deeply thrown askew by that we should conclude there's no such thing as freedom. The French philosopher Baron d'Holbach, who lived from 1723 to 1789, is perhaps the best example of a hard determinist from the early period of modern philosophy. D'Holbach was an extremely wealthy man, having inherited a fortune from a relative, and he lived most of his life in France. He defended many unpopular views that God doesn't exist, that there's no such thing as a soul, and that we don't have free will. D'Holbach's major work was called The System of Nature. It was his official title, but its unofficial title was The Atheist's Bible. As reflected by the title, the official title, The System of Nature, this was offered as a broad philosophy of nature. And d'Holbach thought nature was all there is. There was nothing supernatural or divine. As a result, it was a very ambitious piece of work. He was basically trying to explain the universe. But what's of special interest to us is that in this volume, d'Holbach argues for psychological determinism, the view that every psychological activity, every action, every thought, every intention is determined by prior psychological or physical events. So he thought that ultimately the human mind is a complete gear-like system. Why did he think this? Well, d'Holbach was, as I said, a naturalist. He thought that there wasn't anything divine. He eschewed anything that had any contact with the supernatural. He thought that there had to be a natural explanation for everything. And according to d'Holbach, all there is to nature is matter and motion. Now, it's uncontroversial that matter and motion do exist. And so if d'Holbach can actually explain the rest of the universe in terms of these elements, just matter and motion, then that would be some reason to think that he was right. If he could do the whole job, if he could succeed in explaining the universe just by appealing to these two simple things, matter and motion, then that would be an impressive achievement. So d'Holbach maintains that determinism is true for nature in general. He even says the word chance has no meaning. He says we only use it when we're ignorant of the natural causes. That's what we mean by chance, is basically I don't know. We don't get a lot of argument at this point. D'Holbach is obviously very impressed by the success of Newton's theory of physics. But, of course, d'Holbach didn't have adequate evidence for his deterministic thesis, as I've emphasized in previous lectures. He couldn't have accumulated enough evidence to justify this huge thesis that everything that happens is determined. Rather, his reasons for favoring determinism are probably related to the considerations that I set out in Lecture 4. That is, for anything that happens in nature, it seems like there has to be a causal explanation for why it happened. There has to be an explanation for why the tides work the way that they do, why the planets move the way they do, why objects fall the way they do. That was the driving inspiration behind much of the scientific work of the time, and he was optimistic that this was a universal fact. And I think the right way to think about this is that it was an optimistic framework from the perspective of science, that we might think of determinism as really threatening, but under the aegis of science, you think determinism says, I am going to get an explanation. If I look hard enough, I'll get an explanation. And science has generated numerous successes under that presupposition that we will get an explanation, and that's why we continue to pursue the causal framework. So what Dolbach would maintain is that there's no reason to think that this is going to stop. There's no reason to think that science is going to falter, that it's plausible that everything will be accommodated under a deterministic worldview. And again, we've seen that science over and over has succeeded in producing new discoveries, new medicines, new theories, guided by the presupposition that there has to be an explanation for any phenomenon. Now, since Dolbach rejects anything supernatural, he thinks that humans, too, are just part of nature. He thought that different material objects have different qualities, so he didn't think that you could explain the human mind the same way you would explain motion on a pool table. He thinks that humans are importantly different kinds of physical objects than pool tables, and so you have to build your theory in terms of those distinctive qualities. So our distinctive qualities include things like having motives and passion and personality. Pool balls don't have any of that. So you don't need to appeal to those things when you're explaining the motion of a pool ball. But Dolbach thought that it's important to appreciate that these various activities, these various mental activities, are just activities of the material brain. And that's important because he thinks that this entails that a deterministic story about the mind is the only possibility. It has to be a deterministic story because the mind is just another physical object in some sense. So mental activities fit under the general theory that everything that exists is matter and motion. Mental activities are based on matter just like everything else, and so they too should be deterministically explicable. Now, Dolbach thinks that mental activities are brain activities, and so you might think he should talk a lot about the brain. But the brain science at the time was not exactly sophisticated. One of the few cases that he discusses involves somebody pressing his hand on a patient's exposed brain, and this apparently eliminated all feeling from the subject temporarily. That's one of the few things Dolbach reports in the brain sciences, and that seems like a pretty crude and somewhat barbaric experiment. But in the intervening centuries, we've learned a lot more about the brain, and Dolbach would have been thrilled to see the results, because there seem to be numerous correlations between brain activity and mental activity. And since this is such an important part of his argument, that the mind is a part of material nature, it will be good to recount a bit of the relevant evidence. This is the evidence, the kind of evidence that I think Dolbach would have wanted to bring up in support of his view that the mind is just another part of physical nature. So early on when people in the 20th century started to do brain surgery, they decided that the best approach was to keep the subjects conscious during the process. Your brain has no nerve endings on it. So they would use local anesthetic to take off the skull cap. And then they wanted the patient to be conscious because if you're going to take out a part of their brain, you want to make sure you're not taking out an important part. And so they would stimulate parts of the brain to see, for instance, if it would disrupt language function. And what they found very early on was that stimulating particular parts of the brain would trigger very specific mental experiences. So in one example, a teenage boy was being operated on, and the doctor reports that he would stimulate a part of the brain, and the boy would say, what are you feeling now? The doctor would say that, and the boy would say, oh, nothing. What about now? He'd say, a buzzing. And then at one point, he stimulated a part of the boy's brain, and the boy said, whoa, it's Out to Get Me by my favorite heavy metal band, Guns N' Roses. And so it seems like if we were to believe the subject, stimulating a particular part of his brain activated a particular and fairly rich memory of a song. So here we have an association between a particular mental stimulation or a particular brain stimulation of physical activity in the brain and a mental activity. Another area of research that finds correlations between mental activities and physical activities come from brain damage patients. So I'm going to give two examples here. One example is damage to an area of the brain known as Broca's area. It's an area that we now know has some kind of association with language abilities. So one victim who had damage to this area from a stroke was able to answer questions about vocabulary. He knew what words meant, for even pretty complicated words, like he knew what the word Zeppelin meant. He could explain what a Zeppelin was. And he could also understand simple sentences like the dog chased the cat perfectly well. He had no trouble with that. But he was flummoxed by sentences in the passive voice. So in one example, he was told, the leopard was killed by the lion, and asked, which one died? And the man was unable to answer the question. He just found it just baffling. He didn't know what the answer was, and he didn't know why he didn't know what the answer was. So here we have damage to a specific area of the brain produces a specific mental dysfunction, problems with syntax, problems with grammar. The last case that I want to mention is really a tragic, very sad case, and it's important to recognize that we learn a lot from these brain damage cases, but they're people, and it's very sad. In this case, Clive Waring was a classical music conductor, and he developed a debilitating amnesia from a virus that damaged his hippocampus. If you've seen the movie Memento, the kind of amnesia he had is the kind of amnesia that the character in Memento had. And in Clive's case, every time his wife walked into the hospital room, he thinks it's the first time he's seen her in years. And it's really a tragic story. You see him come in and he's so happy to see her, but then he forgets a couple of minutes later. What's important for us, though, is that this is one more bit of evidence that damaging particular parts of the brain shows an association to damaging particular parts of mental function. And that's exactly the idea that Dolbach wants to promote, that mental functions are inextricably tied to brain functions. Now, we can finally return to the main thread of Dolbach's argument. So he thinks that since the mind is part of material nature, and determinism is true of nature, it follows that determinism holds for the mind as well. Like all matter, the human mind/brain will be subject to physical laws, and those laws are deterministic. Well, how is this supposed to work exactly? How does the mind's determinism work? Well, what Dolbach says is actions are caused by our motives, and these various motives are weighed against each other. In effect, the brain produces actions on the basis of cost-benefit calculation. Whichever action would best serve what a person wants is the one he's determined to pursue. This should sound pretty familiar. It's a lot like the idea Hobbes had. Let's take one of Dolbach's own examples, though. He says, consider a person who's extremely thirsty, and then he sees a water fountain. Dolbach asks, will he come to desire to drink the water? Of course he will, says Dolbach, and he will indeed proceed to take the drink. But then Dolbach says, but maybe someone will object that this is all mistaken. The thirsty man is not determined to take a drink, for what if he thought that it was poisoned? Then he wouldn't take a drink. And Dolbach says, this is no objection at all. The whole point is that the brain calculates the costs and benefits. And what you've done now by saying that the guy thinks that the water's poisoned is you've altered the costs and benefits. If the person thinks the water is poisoned, then it no longer satisfies his motivation. So his action will now answer to this new motivation, and he won't take the drink. So Dolbach says our actions are determined by our motivations. But then you might say, well, but where did those come from? And Dolbach thinks that here we need to tell a deterministic story as well. What a person wants is itself, he thinks, caused by the external world or by internal psychological states. So, do I choose to see the lectern before me? Of course not. Did I choose to like potato chips? No. Did I choose to love alcohol? No. Did I choose to dislike exercise? No, none of this. All of these things are just given to me. These are, Dolbach says, the foundations for our actions, because this is what generates our motivation, but they're not chosen by us. Now, obviously, everything is not so simple. So potato chips and alcohol reveal their rewards very quickly. But let's say something like the attraction to classical music. That isn't something that just pops. You don't just listen to classical music and say, man, that is the greatest thing. It requires some kind of training. Still, Dolbach would say that the explanation for why I like classical music will just appeal to earlier external stimuli and psychological activity. So in my case, I developed a taste for classical music by working at it. But why did I work at it? Well, because I thought that this would be a source of rewarding experiences. Well, why did I think that? Well, because of the friends and teachers that I had that said various things that made me think this. Obviously, we could keep going back to explain why I had the friends and teachers I did. And at a certain point, we will end up with me back in the delivery room with Mom. And at every juncture along the way, at every decision, every motive, every preference, Dolbach says that there will be an explanation for why I ended up with that decision or that preference. There's no room in here for free will, he says. Choice doesn't provide any escape from the causal chain that stretches all the way back to our birth. Now, some people suggest that they can refute determinism by making a particular kind of choice. So the idea is that if I perform some spontaneous action, I can prove that determinism is false. In Dostoevsky's famous novella called Notes from Underground, we find the character who's known as the man from underground rebelling against determinism. He's trying to refute determinism by being irrational. And this is supposed to fly in the face of the determinist, since the determinist, like Dolbach, thinks of decision-making as a rational cost-benefit calculation. So if I can be irrational, then that will show that determinism is false. But Dolbach would laugh at the underground man's attempt. The underground man's attempt to rebel against determinism, he would say, is just a determined response to the fear of determinism. And he'd say, you could hardly refute determinism in this way. He says, when a person tries to refute determinism, that desire, the desire to refute determinism, itself becomes the strongest motive, the one that determines the action. So by trying to show that determinism is false, by doing something really, really stupid, all I've done is I've revealed that I've now let determinism be one of the factors that influences my decisions. So rather than refuting determinism, I've just given them another case of a determined action. Dolbach's argument here is simple. He says, determinism holds for action, for nature in general. Human actions are just part of nature. Human mental activities are ultimately just activities of the material brain. So determinism will hold for action as well as anything else, mental or otherwise. There's no basis for thinking that there's an exception to the rule of determinism that applies for action. There's no reason to think that action has this special status that somehow escapes the net of determinism. So that's Dolbach's argument for determinism. Now he thinks that he can put that together with the rest of the hard determinist argument to get the conclusion that we don't have free will, because he maintains that he would agree with James and Kant that the idea that free will is compatible with determinism is just a desperate attempt to get out of the problem. Dolbach thinks that it's a deep part of the way we think about ourselves, that our actions are not determined. He thinks that that is crucial to our self-conception. But he thinks that we are completely wrong about this because determinism turns out to be true after all. And so he thinks this shows us that there's no such thing as free will. And so to return to the examples of witches and impetus theory, people were so deeply wrong about what they thought about witches. They were so deeply wrong about what they thought about why projectiles move the way that they do, that the proper conclusion to draw in those cases was there's no such thing as witches, there's no such thing as an impetus. Dolbach thinks he has provided the raw materials to draw a similar conclusion about free will. We thought there was such a thing as free will because we thought that determinism was false. But he says now that we know that determinism is true, we should throw away the idea of free will just like we threw away the idea of a witch, and we throw away the idea of impetus as something that gets put into an object. Now, one critical element of Dolbach's argument, obviously, is determinism. He's a hard determinist, so he's been arguing that determinism is true. And so one way to try to avoid that conclusion is to say determinism is not true. It's a mistake to draw these deterministic conclusions on the basis of the kinds of arguments that we have. And so in the next lecture, I want to turn to arguments from skeptics about free will that don't have this liability, that maintain that free will is impossible regardless of whether determinism is true.